Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Reaktor 6 tutorial series. We're going to have a look at sync today. It's one of the options in the bento box oscillator, and it's in the same family as phase, but it does perform a very different task. What we've got in this example here is two oscillators which are phase locked. You can see that they both have a reset input coming from the note in module, which means every time I press a key on the keyboard, both of these oscillators will begin outputting their sawtooth waves at exactly the same time, and we see that in the oscilloscope. This is basically one composite wave that's made up of the two oscillators, basically outputting identical signals. A couple of problems with relying on phase to lock your oscillators together. Firstly, we need this reset command. If I disengage one of these resets, now oscillator 1 is being reset on the keystroke, but oscillator 2 isn't. It's basically freely spinning in the background. So every time I press a key now, these oscillators are going to be out of phase by a different amount every time. You can see the offset. This is the relative offset that you're seeing between those two oscillators. The other problem is that we're relying on the oscillators themselves to be very accurate. If this was an analog system where you can't guarantee over any period of time that the oscillator outputs are going to be entirely consistent, they'll drift and the two oscillators will basically move out of phase and start cancelling, and that can be a very lovely sound and there's nothing wrong with it. But if you want the absolute military precision of these two oscillators being locked together, doing it via phase has two problems. In the digital world, it only really manifests as one, which means you need to keep them absolutely locked together. Let's throw away the concept of locking them together using phase entirely and switch instead to this sync feature. Now I've just noticed that this sync knob is turned up, but by default it'll be at 0 and this oscillator switch down below will be turned off. I'm going to turn it back on and explain it later. It's a little bit complicated just for now. What I'm going to do is hook these two oscillators up. I'm going to throw away all of the reset commands, so we're not relying on phase at all, and instead we're going to rely on sync. I'm going to take a sync output from oscillator 1 and connect it into a sync input in oscillator 2, and I'm going to turn sync up to 100%. What I've done there is I've turned oscillator 1 into a master, sometimes known as a leader, and oscillator 2 into a slave or follower. And what that means is that regardless of the pitch of oscillator 2, within constraints, we'll see that shortly, you're going to hear the pitch of oscillator 1. So watch the tuner, 65 Hz. I'll turn this down nice and quiet so I can talk over the top of it. As I begin increasing the pitch of oscillator 2, you can hear, if I turn it up a little bit more, you can hear the change in tone. You can see that we're getting a different harmonic content out of the output, but we're not getting any change in pitch. Now at the moment you're hearing both oscillators 1 and 2 mixed together, but for the sake of simplicity I'm going to take oscillator 1 completely out of the picture. So now you're only hearing oscillator 2. And now it's really obvious that something unusual is happening because I'm increasing the pitch of oscillator 2 now. It's generating an output of 10 semitones higher than the 65 Hz we're seeing in the tuner. But it doesn't matter because it's been locked to oscillator 1. Well, I'll pull it all the way back down to 1 semitone and have a look at it in, well, either of the oscilloscopes. They're both fine. We'll use the master output oscilloscope over here. What's basically happening is that oscillator 2 is drawing a sawtooth wave, going back to the beginning, starting to draw a new sawtooth wave, because don't forget its pitch is faster than oscillator 1, so it's cycling faster. So this is one entire oscillation plus a little bit of the second oscillation. And at this point where my mouse is pointing, oscillator 1 comes along and generates an instruction to oscillator 2 to reset its phase. In other words, to start drawing its wave from the beginning again. You see it snap up to the top and begin drawing the sawtooth again. I increase the pitch by another semitone. Now oscillator 2 is going to get slightly further along in the drawing of that second wave before once again it's instructed to reset and start drawing the wave again. What that means is that you get in this shape one full sawtooth plus a little bit, 65 times a second. That is a much stronger indication to the tuner of what the pitch of the tone actually is. Oscillator 2 has been basically subverted to draw as much of its waveform as it can in 1/65th of a second, but ultimately it is subject to the whim of Oscillator 1. And as an extension of that, if I now press a note and increase the pitch of Oscillator 1, which you can't hear Oscillator 1, but if I increase the pitch of Oscillator 1, the pitch goes up and back down again. Because it's the period specified by this oscillator which is determining the overall pitch. So basically sync is a phase reset device. Every time I press that C2 on the keyboard, which corresponds to 65 Hz, that's generating that number of instructions to oscillator 2 to begin drawing its wave shape again. It happens to be cycling much faster than that, well, slightly faster than that at the moment. And as we increase the pitch, you can see it getting further and further along the drawing of that wave. Now, an interesting thing happens when we get to 12. Suddenly the pitch goes up to 131 Hz, there or thereabouts. And that's because the tuner now recognises the shape it's seeing. Oscillator 2 is able to draw two complete waveforms in exactly the right amount of time. When Oscillator 1 comes along and delivers a command to reset the phase, well, Oscillator 2 is already there. It's actually at the same point in its phase journey as it would have been anyway. So at this exact moment in time, and for every multiple in terms of octaves, in other words, when you have a pure frequency multiplier, sync kind of goes out the window. It's still doing its thing, and in the analog world, it would still have an effect. But in this perfect digital world where all of the numbers are so accurate, you're not actually seeing any manifestation of any kind of significant result. When we go to 13, we're going to drop back down to 65 Hz. So now we're getting 2 and a bit waveforms. Here's the first waveform, here's the second, here's a little bit of the third before we perform a reset. And this is still not sufficient to convince the tuner that we're anything other than 65 Hz. There's going to come a point eventually when the complexity of the wave that's being drawn inside this window of opportunity, these 65 windows of opportunity for Oscillator 2 to do something, now it's doing so much that the tuner's finally figuring out that something weird is going on, and now it's catching the real pitch. Here you can see we've got 2 full waves being drawn and half of the third wave, and the tuner's finally realised what's going on. From this point onwards, the tuning is going to track. Not that it sounds particularly harmonious, shall we say? I don't know what the right word is. I didn't want to say nice because everything's so subjective. But we're still getting that dramatic resetting of phase. We're still getting that really complex harmonic structure. It's just that the tuner now knows what's going on. Let's have a look. I'll just reset Oscillator 2 back to 0. Let's have a look at what's going on out of this sync output, because it's really interesting. Almost unfathomable, but really interesting. I'm going to speed the scope up as fast as I possibly can. So it's now refreshing 50 times a millisecond, or 50,000 times a second. So you can see that the instructions coming out of this sync port are very fast indeed. This is not a standard control signal. It's a dedicated communication channel between these oscillators that's specifically designed to enable one oscillator to identify when another oscillator is at phase 0. What I mean by phase 0 is basically coming up through 0 at the beginning of the drawing of each of these waves. We can actually sync to inputs of oscillators using any instruction. If I take an output from the sine port, for instance, you will get an approximation of something that does a very similar job. This is a very similar effect. You can see that the pitch is staying at 65 Hz. You can see that we've got multiple waves being drawn before the reset command comes in. So any signal at this sync input that's basically oscillating many times a second and going through 0 is going to generate the right kind of instruction, but it's not guaranteed. Whereas the sync output, the dedicated sync output on this oscillator is guaranteed to be correctly synchronized. I'll plug the proper sync back in, and now we'll have a look at this oscillator switch that I asked you to ignore earlier, because this is the switch that toggles between sync outputs and non-sync outputs. So as you can see, it says it should be enabled when the sync input is fed with a dedicated sync signal, as we have here. If I'm taking an input from a sine, the help actually says this option needs to be disabled. Well, it's not going to explode if you don't, but you're going to get basically undefined results. The signal that this thing is expecting to see is not the signal it's actually receiving. It just so happens in this particular case that we are getting an approximation of the same output. If I turn oscillator syncing off, you can see that we've got quite a different output. It's essentially half rectified the wave, it's chopped it off so that we're getting a flat line for half the period. This leads me neatly into the subject of soft and hard syncing. All of the examples that we've seen today have been hard sync. I've turned this knob all the way up to full and we didn't do anything in between. Well, all of the values in between 0 and 100 deal with a subject called soft syncing. The best way to demonstrate soft syncing is to go back to our dedicated sync connection, and I'm going to offset these oscillators by a single semitone. So here we are hard synced, and you can see 1 semitone's worth of progress into the second wave before we reset. Now I'm going to press that same note, and now I'm going to start pulling the sync value back, and you can see that the difference between those two waves is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In other words, oscillator 2 is drawing more than it should. It's basically being allowed to get further than it should before it's being reset. The best way to think about what soft syncing is doing is think of it like a nudge, as if the phase of oscillator 2 is being nudged towards oscillator 1. If I pull this knob all the way down to 0 now, you'll see that the offset between these waves gets bigger and bigger and bigger until finally, when I pull the sync all the way down to 0, we're left with a perfect C sharp, the note that oscillator 2 is actually outputting. So this is where we start. If I now head back in the opposite direction, it might be a little bit more intuitive. We're going to start outputting a wave at 69 Hz, and as I begin introducing sync, you can see that wave being gradually phase shifted further and further towards the point where ultimately, when we arrive back at the point of hard sync, they're fully locked together. And when they are fully locked together and we have that consistency of output again, the tuner once again changes its mind and says, this is 65 Hz, this isn't 69. Now, in the world of analog synthesis, hard sync is far the more common, because this sound when used in conjunction with slightly more interesting waves than a standard sawtooth, can generate some really interesting, kind of fairly brutal sounds. So lots of analog synths, particularly from the late 70s and early 80s, had a hard sync option. The soft sync option is a more subtle beast, because you're going to get this basically transition between, you're going to have problems with your tunings for starters, because you're not going to be able to guarantee that the master oscillator is generating the correct pitch anymore. But from a sound design perspective, absolutely valid, nothing wrong with it at all. Final thing that I'm going to show you today is the difference between increasing the pitch of oscillator 2 faster than oscillator 1 and decreasing it so that it's slower. So all of the examples that I've done today have pointedly increased the pitch of oscillator 2. If I pull the pitch of oscillator 2 below the output of the master, suddenly we get a much less interesting output. I'll just connect back into my scope again, reset it to 0, and now start pulling the pitch down, and you can see The sawtooth being truncated, the bit at the bottom below the curve is basically being chopped off as the phase of oscillator 2 is being reset and starting to redraw again. But as you can see in the scope output, it's just a sawtooth, just having basically a bit of the wave chopped off. And so you're getting a reduction in volume because the signal's smaller, but nothing particularly interesting going on harmonically. The situation's a little bit more interesting if you use different wave shapes. Ironically, sine is more interesting than a sawtooth from a harmonic perspective when we dip below 0, because now with oscillator 2 cycling slower than oscillator 1, it's not getting an opportunity to draw its entire sine wave before its phase gets reset. That means so we're getting all of this and all of this, and we're coming down, and then here, this straight line below the curve is where the phase is being reset and it's starting to draw the wave again. That's a more interesting shape than a single sine tone, and so we've got all of these extra harmonics that you're now hearing. Nevertheless, even though you have a more interesting sound, typically you'll generally tend to push the slave or follower oscillator faster than the master oscillator when you're playing with sync options. That'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.